Hey everyone, you're watching We Had That, and today I'm going to talk about the 1988 Wave 7 G.I. Joe figure Hit and Run. If you've watched any of my videos for the G.I. Joe figures from 1988 or later, you've heard me say that as a kid, I preferred my Joe team to look like they might have actually been guys in the military. I'm sure I didn't know exactly what actually looked like a military uniform and what didn't, but I did know that no one in the military was dressed like Windmill. There were still a few cool Joes in 1988. The Tiger Force and Night Force repaints were often very cool, even though I didn't have them at the time, but when it came to new characters, there were a lot of figures that just didn't interest me. Of all the new guys, I think Repeater and Hit and Run were the two that looked the most like military guys to me. Repeater looked like he'd make a great addition to the desert troops, and as far as I knew, Steadicam machine gunner could have been a real thing, while Hit and Run looked like he was ready for jungle warfare. His basic uniform consisted of a camouflage shirt, camouflage pants, black boots, a green helmet, and a climbing harness molded onto his torso. He wore a green helmet with red goggles and had both his face and hands painted camouflage to match the outfit. Interestingly, according to Hit and Run's file card, his primary military specialty is infantry, with his secondary military specialty is mountaineering. Does that mean that Hit and Run sometimes works with Alpine, the mountain trooper for G.I. Joe? Hit and Run's real name is Brent Scott. He's an orphan, and it is specifically mentioned in his file card that his parents were killed by a drunk driver when he was only 3 years old. If you were alive in the 1980s, you might remember that "Don't drink and drive" was a slogan that we heard a lot. His file card also mentions that Hit and Run used to climb down the sheer walls of his orphanage with alarming regularity and run away. But when asked why he was running away, he would say he wasn't running away, he was practicing. It goes on to say that he joined the Army as early as he could, which meant he left one institution only to find himself immediately in another institution. The file card then explains that infantrymen do a lot of running. It's a little odd to me that a kid would think of the amount of running he would do in the Army rather than the amount of fighting, but I guess you've got to explain the run part of the name Hit and Run. While the character was in development, a couple of other names were considered: Night Raid and Rope Burn. I never thought that the name Hit and Run was one of the better code names for a Joe, but Night Raid wouldn't have been a lot better to me, and Rope Burn? It really feels like the Hasbro G.I. Joe development team was running out of steam by 1988. Hit and Run came with a few accessories. First, he came with a black Colt 9mm submachine gun, which in real life is relatively lightweight, compact, somewhat easy to conceal, and similar in use to an M16. Since it's 9mm, it's low recoil, so it has less muzzle climb, resulting in a more accurate weapon, especially when it's set to fully automatic fire. Colt started manufacturing them in 1982, which is when the United States military began using them, so giving one to a G.I. Joe figure in 1988 would have been pretty realistic. The second accessory included with Hit and Run was a black duffel bag with a rope inside that attached to a grappling hook. The rope could be extended and the grappling hook attached to something so that you could pretend that Hit and Run would climb up the rope. When he was done climbing, the handle on the duffel bag could be used to wind the rope back into the bag. Lastly, Hit and Run came with a big green knife which attached to the outside of the duffel bag. I always liked it when the gear fit together, such as when a knife or a gun fit into the backpack. So even though he may not have had the most gear, the gear that Hit and Run came with was very cool to me. A military accurate gun, a knife that attached to the duffel bag, a grappling hook and rope that could be wound back up into the bag. Cool stuff as a kid. Hit and Run didn't ever appear in the G.I. Joe cartoon. The G.I. Joe cartoon that most people remember was created by Sunbow and ended in 1987 with the G.I. Joe movie. There was no cartoon at all in 1988, so the next chance he would have had was a new cartoon that started in 1989, produced by Dick. but by then, they had mostly moved on to feature the new characters whose figures were on the store shelves in 1989. Hit and Run never made an appearance. In fact, I believe the only time that he's ever been animated were in a couple of 1988 commercials for G.I. Joe vehicles. Hit and Run only appeared in one issue of the regular G.I. Joe comic, and that was issue number 80. Even there, he only had a very small role in the story, only appearing in a handful of panels. He did show up more in G.I. Joe Special Missions, where he appeared in 3 issues. The Special Missions comics were separate from the main storyline that progressed through the regular issues, but were isolated one-off stories which were often, in my opinion, more serious and better stories than the main run. I liked the main run quite a bit, so don't get me wrong, but many of the Special Mission stories just seemed maybe a little bit more mature. Anyway, Hit and Run first appeared in Special Missions in issue number 17, where he actually had a decent part in the story, but except for one panel where he had some face paint on, the rest of the story shows him without any face paint. It must have been some kind of a mistake. He was actually using his mountaineering skills to some degree also by climbing up the wall of a building. Next, he appeared in Special Missions number 22, where he wasn't wearing face paint or even his camo uniform at all. He was instead wearing a solid white jumpsuit. The issue seemed to be written more for Shockwave, as it was kind of a SWAT team story. So even though Hit and Run was fine for the role in the story, the role could have been filled by many different Joes just as well, and didn't use any of Hit and Run's specialties. Last, he appeared in Special Missions number 23, titled Scoop, where he actually had his face paint on, but he was once again essentially just a background character in a story that was more focused on, as the name implies, the character Scoop. So overall, I'm surprised how few appearances Hit and Run made in any of the comics in the series. Even though Hit and Run didn't show up in the cartoon and barely made it into the comic book, he did appear a couple of times on G.I. Joe box art. On the Warthog box, you can see him exiting the Warthog with his gun blazing, and the Mean Dog box art also features the character. Hit and Run was even used a few times on random G.I. Joe products. For example, he was one of the character models in the G.I. Joe face paint kit, and on the paint and marker book, they used Hit and Run on the cover. I'm guessing that's because by 1988, he was one of the few Joes who still looked like someone who might be in the military. As I said before, by 1988, some of the Tiger Force and Night Force figures were cool, even though I didn't have them as a kid, but most of the regular release figures weren't really what I wanted from my G.I. Joes. I did like Shockwave and Repeater pretty well, but since Hit and Run really looked like an army guy to me, I thought he was easily one of the coolest from that wave. So with that feeling, I kind of think it's a shame that he arrived the year when there wasn't a cartoon and he wasn't very well utilized in the comic book. I think Hasbro really missed an opportunity with this guy, and I wonder if they kind of knew that. There was a Target exclusive Hit and Run who is exactly the same as the regular Hit and Run, but he came with an additional green backpack with a working parachute. Okay, but you could get pretty much the same parachute backpack through mail-away offers from Hasbro from way back in 1985 all the way up into the 90s. If you're a collector trying to pick up the Target exclusive figure loose and want all original parts, make sure the backpack is labeled China rather than Hong Kong. The Hong Kong backpacks were the mail-away ones, and the China backpacks were technically the ones that came with the Hit and Run Target exclusive. But honestly, they look so similar that unless you're really concerned about the details, you can get either one and it looks fine in your collection. There was also a Brazilian variation released by Estrela called Alpinista, codename Hit and Run, with some minor color variations. Basically, his hands and face weren't painted the base coat of green like the regular American release. They had more of a natural skin color under the camouflage lines that seemed to be dark green or black. I believe he also came with different weapons and no duffel bag or rope with a grappling hook. I mentioned Tiger Force earlier. I don't know if I ever saw them as a kid, but even though they're not 100% military looking, I think a lot of them are pretty cool. They basically just used the same molds and painted them slightly differently, or in some cases, crazy differently. In Europe, there was an exclusive Tiger Force figure for Hit and Run. They used the same molds like a lot of the ones in the United States, but different paint apps. He came with the exact same accessories in the same colors, but the figure was less military looking than the other 3 versions because the paint apps were a little bit crazy. Did you have a Hit and Run action figure when you were a kid? Was he a favorite of yours, or was he just another bullet catcher on your team? Tell me in the comments below. Also, please give this video a thumbs up, and if you have a chance, it would be great if you would share it on social media. If you enjoy my content, please subscribe to my channel and hit that notifications bell so I can let you know when I post new videos. And one last thing, if you're a fan of toys, you should know about ToyLanta, the biggest toy show in the southeastern United States, held annually just north of Atlanta, Georgia. Visit ToyLanta.com for more information. As always, thanks for watching.